It was a quiet afternoon in a suburban neighborhood, the kind where lawns are meticulously trimmed and neighbors wave as they pass by. But in one particular community, that peace was disrupted in a way that no one could have predicted. A disagreement over HOA rules escalated when a woman, frustrated over what she believed to be violations, called the police on a black man who lived just a few doors down. It was a moment that could have fractured the community. But instead, it became a turning point. The man, calm and composed, did not respond with anger or defensiveness. He stood firmly, not just for himself, but as an example of dignity and restraint in the face of misunderstanding. Around him, neighbors began to gather, sensing the tension, witnessing how quickly fear and prejudice can enter a space if left unchecked. What happened next was a lesson in the power of unity. People began speaking to each other, asking questions, and listening, not with judgment, but with curiosity and empathy. In that moment, ordinary individuals became extraordinary. A neighbor stepped forward to mediate, another offered to organize a community meeting, and a local leader reminded everyone of the shared responsibility they had, not just to rules, but to each other. It was not about who was right or wrong, but about choosing courage over division, conversation over confrontation, and understanding over suspicion. The police, too, played a vital role, not as enforcers of punishment, but as facilitators of dialogue. They listened to both sides and helped ensure that the immediate tension would not escalate into something irreversible. Through their presence, they reminded everyone that justice and fairness require patience, perspective, and a willingness to see beyond surface judgments. By the end of that day, something remarkable had begun. The community, shaken but resolute, committed to do better. HOA meetings would now include open forums, neighbors pledged to meet with one another before escalating issues, and a renewed sense of respect began to spread. What could have been a story of division became a story of hope. A testament to what happens when people choose integrity, empathy, and perseverance over fear. The lesson is clear: change begins with each of us. When we respond to conflict with patience, when we listen before judging, when we act not out of fear, but out of responsibility, we transform ordinary situations into opportunities for growth and understanding. This story reminds us that the power of community lies not in rules alone, but in the human hearts behind them. So, let this be a call to action. Stand firm in your dignity. Speak with compassion. Listen with intent, and always believe that even in moments of tension, there is a chance to build bridges, to heal divides, and to create a future that is brighter, fairer, and stronger because we chose unity over division. It began like any ordinary afternoon in the quiet suburban streets where families had lived for years, where children played freely on trimmed lawns, and the hum of daily life was punctuated only by the occasional passing car or bark of a neighbor's dog. The neighborhood had always prided itself on its sense of order, a sense of community bound together by rules, expectations, and the quiet reassurance that everything had a place and every person knew it. But that sense of calm, that fragile illusion of perfect order, was about to be disrupted by a single phone call, an ordinary device transmitting extraordinary consequences. The call came from a woman, her voice tight with frustration, a trembling undercurrent betraying more than words could express. She spoke with authority, with conviction, reporting what she believed to be a violation of the community's rules. Her concerns, valid in her perception, were straightforward: an appeal to authority to enforce order, to preserve the way she believed the neighborhood should function. But what she did not know was that this call, meant to correct, would ripple outward in ways she could never have anticipated, touching lives, igniting tensions, and forcing everyone to confront the deeper questions of fear, judgment, and empathy. On the other end of that line, the police dispatcher listened, noting details, the urgency, the insistence in her voice. Calls like these were routine, but even routine calls have consequences that cannot be measured in advance. Officers were dispatched, their minds trained to assess threats, mediate disputes, and ensure safety, yet unaware that this particular situation would challenge more than just their procedural skills. It would test the very nature of perception, of bias, and of human reaction under pressure. The man in question, a black man who had lived in the neighborhood for years, was unaware of the approaching storm. His day had been ordinary, perhaps tending to his garden, perhaps walking his dog along familiar streets. There had been no sign that this seemingly peaceful environment could transform so suddenly into a theater of tension, scrutiny, and fear. And yet, without warning, the phone call had summoned forces that would cast a shadow over him, a shadow that would test his patience, his dignity, and his capacity to remain calm in the face of assumptions and suspicion. Neighbors began to notice. Doors cracked open, curious eyes peered from behind curtains, and the hum of normalcy began to give way to whispers and uncertainty. Some felt unease, wondering what had prompted such action. Others felt a flicker of anticipation, the subtle thrill that comes when lives intersect in unexpected, dramatic ways. They did not yet know who was right, who was wrong, or what the outcome would be, but the tension was palpable. In the waiting moments before the officers arrived, a strange kind of silence fell over the street. It was the silence of anticipation, of people poised on the edge of discovery, each aware that something significant was unfolding, yet uncertain of its shape. Every rustle of leaves, every distant footstep, every passing car seemed amplified, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. The neighborhood, usually so predictable, had become a stage where ordinary lives were about to intersect with authority, perception, and judgment in ways that no one could have scripted. And there, in the midst of this fragile, trembling calm, the question lingered, unspoken yet pressing. How would this story unfold? Would fear dictate the actions of those involved, or would understanding prevail? Would the neighbors remain mere spectators, or would they step forward, guided by empathy and courage, to influence the outcome? Even as the first police car turned the corner, lights flashing faintly, the neighborhood held its breath. The ordinary had become extraordinary. The mundane had transformed into a moment pregnant with possibility, a moment in which every action, every choice, every word could tilt the scales toward conflict or toward a deeper understanding of what it means to live together, to judge less, and to act with both responsibility and compassion. He stood in the middle of his driveway, the sun casting long shadows across the street, illuminating the perfectly trimmed lawns and the neat rows of houses that lined the neighborhood. To the casual observer, it was an ordinary scene, the quiet rhythm of suburban life continuing without interruption. But he was anything but ordinary at that moment. Alone, facing an unexpected and unnerving confrontation, he became a figure of quiet strength, the center of a storm that no one had foreseen. The woman's call to the police had set events into motion, yet he remained calm, an island of composure in the rising tide of tension. Around him, neighbors watched from behind their curtains, some with curiosity, others with fear, wondering what this man would do, how he would respond. They could not know the history behind his quiet demeanor, the inner fortitude forged by years of challenges, the countless moments in life that had prepared him for exactly this type of scrutiny, for exactly this type of misjudgment. It would have been easy to react with anger, to shout, to accuse, to allow frustration and fear to dictate his every move. But he did not. Instead, he breathed deeply, grounding himself in principles far larger than any single conflict. He understood, perhaps better than anyone else on the street, that the moment demanded more than a reaction. It demanded a choice. And that choice was one of integrity. The police car approached slowly, its engine humming, its lights reflecting off the pavement, illuminating the faces of neighbors who had begun to emerge from their homes, drawn by the tension, drawn by the uncertainty of what might happen. In the eyes of those who watched, the man could have been seen as vulnerable, as threatened, as powerless. Yet there was something in the way he carried himself, a calm, unshakable dignity, that suggested he was far from powerless. Each step the officers took toward him was measured, professional and observant, but also tentative in a way that acknowledged the unpredictability of human behavior under stress. What they did not yet know, and what no one could predict, was how his choices in these moments would shape the narrative of the entire neighborhood. Every gesture, every pause, every word carried weight, though none of them could know exactly how heavy that weight would be until it was too late. Neighbors whispered among themselves, exchanging glances filled with anticipation. Some felt unease, unsure of what they were witnessing or what it might mean. Others felt a strange sense of hope, sensing that there was someone who could turn a moment of conflict into a lesson of perseverance and understanding. And still others wondered silently, would he falter? Would he stand his ground, or would the pressure overwhelm him? He did not speak immediately. Instead, he allowed the silence to speak, a silence that was anything but empty. It was full of intention, of patience, of a resolve that can only be formed through enduring countless unseen trials in life. In that silence, there was power. In that silence, there was clarity. And in that silence, the neighborhood felt something it had not expected, an invitation to witness something extraordinary in what appeared to be ordinary circumstances. As the officers drew closer, the tension escalated. Questions formed but were not yet asked. Judgments hovered, but were not yet declared. Every person watching felt a subtle shift in the air, a sense that something monumental, something that could redefine their understanding of courage and humanity, was about to unfold, but no one knew exactly how. He raised his hand slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement and calm. It was enough to arrest the rising panic, enough to remind everyone, including the police, that human beings have within them a capacity for self-control, for empathy, for reasoned courage that defies expectation. Yet, even as this moment passed in its fragile perfection, there lingered an unspoken question: what would come next, when words were exchanged, when interpretations collided, and when the real test of character revealed itself? The neighborhood streets, once quiet and predictable, had transformed into a theater of observation. Windows that were usually closed or curtains drawn now revealed faces peering out, each neighbor a silent witness to the unfolding scene. Some leaned on their doorframes, arms crossed, trying to appear nonchalant, while others whispered to each other, unsure of what to say, yet unable to look away. They were watching, yes, but the question lingered in the air: were they truly seeing what was happening, or merely projecting their assumptions onto it? From the moment the woman had called the police, the street had changed. The air carried a tension that was almost tangible, a combination of fear, curiosity, and judgment. Every movement of the man standing calmly in his driveway, every measured step of the approaching officers, every subtle reaction of those around them was magnified, dissected in the minds of the observers. But beyond mere observation lay a deeper question, one that could not be answered by looking alone. Could they recognize the courage and restraint being displayed, or would they only see what fear had convinced them was true? Among the neighbors, there were those who felt a flicker of hope. They saw the man standing alone, unshaken by the calls to authority, and wondered if perhaps this could be more than a confrontation, if it could be a lesson in integrity, in perseverance, in the power of composure. But hope is fragile, and for many it battled silently against preconceptions, assumptions, and the stories their minds had already begun to write. It was a reminder that seeing is never purely about vision. It is about perception, awareness, and the willingness to confront one's own biases. As the minutes stretched, a strange dynamic began to emerge. Neighbors who had once been strangers now shared an unspoken connection, a recognition that they were all participants in something larger than themselves. Some of them shifted closer to the street, leaning forward, trying to catch a glimpse of what the officers would do, how the man would respond. Others remained behind closed doors, cautious, hesitant, yet equally drawn by the gravity of the moment. And still, the question persisted: would anyone step forward, not just to watch, but to act in a way that could change the course of events? The police officers approached, their steps deliberate, their eyes scanning the scene for threats that were invisible to most. They noted the tension in the air, the silence that hung heavier than any words, and the way neighbors watched as if on the edge of revelation. Yet even as they assessed the situation, the ultimate truth remained elusive. The actions that would truly define this moment were not just those of the officers or the man, but of everyone who had become an observer, each holding a fragment of responsibility in their hands. Every subtle gesture, the slight tilt of a head, the quiet nod exchanged between neighbors, the measured breathing of the man in the driveway, carried meaning, though none could fully interpret it. Some neighbors interpreted strength where there was patience, patience where there was fear, and fear where there was integrity. In that ambiguity, the suspense deepened. Who would understand the reality before them? Who would see clearly, and who would allow their assumptions to dictate the narrative? There was a tension in timing, too. Moments passed slowly, each heartbeat stretched into eternity. The street seemed suspended in a delicate balance, as if at any second, one action could tip the scales. A single word, a misstep, a sudden movement, Any of these could ignite conflict or bring relief, yet no one knew which was imminent. The uncertainty was palpable, and each observer felt it differently, some with dread, some with curiosity, some with the quiet thrill that comes when ordinary people witness something extraordinary unfolding. And yet, amid the watchful eyes and whispered speculations, the deeper story remained hidden. The man's calm was not passive, nor was it naive. It was a conscious choice, a demonstration of strength that required more courage than most would ever know. And, while the neighbors watched, truly seeing or understanding remained optional. The suspense lay in what would happen when perception collided with reality, when observation gave way to action, and when courage faced the unspoken judgments of those who had been mere witnesses until now. In every neighborhood, there exists a delicate balance, an invisible thread that separates minor disagreements from full-blown conflicts. It is a line no one can see until it is crossed, and yet crossing it can happen in a single moment, often unnoticed until consequences emerge. On this particular day, that line was thinner than ever, stretched taut by fear assumptions and the weight of a single phone call that had summoned authority into an ordinary street. The complaint had seemed simple at first, a violation of HOA rules, a perceived breach of expectations. To the woman who made the call, it was a matter of principle, a way to maintain order and protect the values she believed her community should uphold. Yet, complaints are rarely just about facts. They are reflections of perspective, of personal standards, and of the subtle fears that shape how we perceive those around us. What seemed to her like a straightforward issue became, in the eyes of others, the spark that could ignite a series of unpredictable reactions. For the man at the center of it, the complaint was more than an inconvenience. It was a test of character, a measure of how far patience could stretch before it tore under pressure. He understood that responding with anger would not resolve the situation. It would only escalate it, transforming a procedural call into a confrontation with consequences far beyond what anyone could anticipate. And yet, standing there in his driveway, he also knew that passivity carried its own risks. The line between standing firm and provoking conflict was fine, almost imperceptible, and each choice he made was laden with uncertainty. Neighbors observed from the periphery, many unaware of the invisible tension that hung in the air. Some whispered conjectures about the man's intentions, while others speculated on what the woman's complaint truly meant. They had become both spectators and participants, their assumptions subtly influencing how events would unfold. In that delicate space between observation and action, even a small movement, a gesture, a word, a glance, could tip the scale toward resolution or chaos. The police officers arrived with measured steps, trained to assess threats and de-escalate disputes, yet even their experience could not predict the fragile dynamics at play. They approached with caution, aware that the line between complaint and conflict was thinner than it appeared. Every word they spoke, every action they took had the potential to either calm the situation or push it over the edge. The neighborhood held its collective breath, watching the unfolding drama, wondering who would falter and who would rise to the challenge. As the man calmly explained his perspective, his voice steady and controlled, the neighbors began to feel the tension in a new way. Words that might have seemed ordinary in another context now carried weight, meaning that could sway judgment, perception, and the course of events. The thin line separating complaint from conflict was not just about the facts of the HOA rules, it was about understanding, empathy, and the courage to respond thoughtfully in the face of pressure. Yet the suspense remained. No one knew who would make the first mistake. No one knew if fear or misunderstanding would triumph over reason. Every subtle glance, every hesitant step, every question posed in cautious tones was like a drop of water threatening to tip a precariously balanced scale. The observers, even those who felt detached, were drawn into the gravity of the moment, acutely aware that ordinary actions could trigger extraordinary consequences. In the midst of it all, the man remained composed, aware that true strength is measured not by confrontation, but by restraint. His patience was a beacon, but even beacons can be dimmed by storm clouds, and the storm of perception, assumption, and human fear was ever present. The question that haunted everyone watching was this: would the situation remain a complaint, something resolvable with calm discussion, or would it transform into conflict, a struggle that would challenge the very bonds of community? Every heartbeat in the street seemed to echo the uncertainty of that line. The thin boundary between complaint and conflict was invisible, yet its presence was palpable. Everyone could sense that the next moments would define not only the outcome of this single incident, but also the trust, understanding, and resilience of the entire neighborhood. And still, no one could see exactly where that line ended, or who would cross it first, leaving a suspense that lingered in every eye, every whisper, and every pause of anticipation. The air on the street had grown heavier, charged with unspoken tension and murmurs that bounced between houses like restless shadows. Voices began to rise, some tentative, others sharp and insistent, each expressing opinions, assumptions, and fears that had been quietly brewing long before the police arrived. Words spilled into the open, fragments of anger, judgment, and concern, yet the most critical question remained who, if anyone, was truly listening. Every statement carried weight, even those unspoken. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, their tones ranging from curiosity to condemnation, as if simply observing was not enough to absolve them of responsibility. In the driveway, the man stood quietly, taking in each voice with a composure that belied the tension swirling around him. He understood that the challenge was not just in responding to the accusations, but in sensing the deeper currents beneath the words, the fears, the biases, and the expectations that shaped every utterance. As the police officers moved carefully through the scene, they, too, became attuned to the rising cacophony of voices. Each statement, each exclamation, added to a delicate tapestry of perception where every observer had their own interpretation of reality. Officers recognized the volatility of the moment, the thin line separating dialogue from discord, yet even their training could not account for the unpredictable force of collective attention and judgment. Some voices called for immediate action, demanding consequences without pause for explanation. Others sought clarity, questions punctuated by doubt and curiosity. Still others murmured silently, their observations more subtle but equally potent, carrying the unspoken power to influence the mood and behavior of those around them. In this environment, speaking was not just communication, it was a test, a trial of patience, perspective, and understanding. The man's response was deliberate. He spoke calmly, measured, conveying not only facts but also the restraint and dignity that only comes from experience and self-awareness. Yet even his composed words could be misinterpreted, twisted by assumptions and fears into something threatening or defiant. In this moment, the street itself became a stage where perception could easily outweigh reality, where voices rising could drown out reason, and where listening, or failing to listen, could determine the trajectory of the encounter. The neighbors were not merely bystanders. Each one had the power to either escalate or diffuse the situation, to magnify misunderstanding, or to foster clarity. Some instinctively leaned toward judgment, their assumptions coloring every interpretation. Others hesitated, waiting to see the outcome before committing to a stance, caught in a delicate dance between curiosity and caution. And still others felt a stirring of hope, sensing that even in chaos there might be an opportunity to witness courage, integrity, and calm. Time stretched thin, each moment pregnant with possibility. The rising voices layered over the ambient sounds of the neighborhood. The distant bark of a dog, the rustle of leaves in the trees, the faint hum of a passing car, created an almost cinematic tension. Every word had potential consequences, yet no one could predict how it would unfold. Who would truly listen? Who would hear beyond the noise and see the humanity at the center of the storm? Even the woman who had made the call was caught in the whirlwind of her own voice, her concerns amplified by the responses and murmurs of those around her. She could not yet see the perspective of the man she had called the authorities on, nor the broader implications of what her single act had set into motion. Her voice, like all the others, carried influence, capable of clarifying, complicating, or escalating the situation depending on how it was received. The suspense built not in what was said, but in what might yet be heard, in the choices that would determine whether communication became confrontation or understanding. Every raised voice had the potential to ignite conflict or to illuminate clarity. And yet, in the midst of the noise, the true question lingered in every mind on the street, who, if anyone, would listen deeply enough to recognize what truly mattered, and how would that recognition, or the absence of it, shape what came next. In every community, There are moments when the ordinary transforms into something extraordinary, when the seemingly mundane reveals the hidden reservoirs of courage that lie within everyday people. On this particular street, as voices rose and tensions simmered, that transformation was quietly beginning. It was not marked by fanfare or spectacle, but by small, deliberate acts of bravery. Actions that, if noticed, could change the trajectory of the day and the understanding of everyone watching. The man standing in his driveway, calm yet alert, was one such figure, embodying a courage that few would recognize in its subtlety. His bravery was not loud or dramatic. It was rooted in self-control, in the refusal to allow fear or prejudice to dictate his response. He understood that true courage is measured not by confrontation, but by the ability to remain steadfast in the face of potential misunderstanding, to uphold dignity when the world seems poised to strip it away. And in this ordinary man, the extraordinary was quietly taking shape. Neighbors, often accustomed to routine and predictability, were now faced with a rare opportunity to witness courage firsthand. Some were drawn forward, hesitant, but compelled by the unfolding situation, realizing that they had a role to play in shaping how the encounter would progress. One neighbor, usually quiet and reserved, stepped toward the driveway, offering a voice of reason, a bridge between conflicting perceptions. Another, holding back moments earlier, now nodded in silent acknowledgement, silently signaling that empathy and understanding could exist even amid fear and suspicion. Even the police officers, trained for confrontation and de-escalation, were confronted with a form of courage that was different from their own. It was not the courage of authority or enforcement, but the courage of character, the bravery of a person who refuses to let circumstances define him, who meets judgment with patience, and who demonstrates that strength lies as much in restraint as in action. They observed, adjusted their approach, and in doing so, became participants in a narrative larger than any procedural protocol could predict. The woman who had made the original complaint was caught off guard by this display of quiet heroism. Her expectations had been clear. She anticipated tension, perhaps even confrontation. But the man's composure, combined with the neighbor's gradual engagement, introduced a variable she had not accounted for: the possibility that courage could take forms that did not fit preconceived notions. And in that possibility lay suspense. The sense that the story was far from resolved, that each decision moving forward would carry weight beyond the immediate situation. Every small action, from a nod of reassurance to a carefully chosen word, contributed to a web of influence that none of the observers could fully grasp. The courage displayed was contagious, subtly encouraging others to act with integrity, to speak with empathy, and to rise above the instinctive reactions that had brought them to the brink of division. And yet, even as hope stirred, uncertainty lingered. Who would follow this example? Who would allow fear or bias to override the inspiration they were witnessing? The tension in the street was a paradox. It was heavy with anticipation, yet alive with the potential for transformation. Each person who dared to act with courage, no matter how small the gesture, was rewriting the script of the moment. The ordinary became extraordinary not in grand declarations, but in simple, intentional choices that demanded attention, reflection, and ultimately, courage from all who watched. The suspense deepened as the community stood at a crossroads. Would they allow this moment of bravery to guide them toward understanding, or would the weight of assumptions and fear drag the situation back toward conflict? Every observer, whether in the driveway, behind a curtain, or on the edge of the sidewalk, felt the pressure of this unspoken question. The line between ordinary behavior and extraordinary action had never seemed so fragile, and yet the potential impact of crossing it was immense. Even in the calmest gestures, the man's steady gaze, the neighbor's gentle intervention, the police officer's measured approach, there was an undercurrent of suspense. The audience, both on the street and in the minds of those watching from afar, was left questioning who would rise to the occasion next, and how far would the courage of these ordinary people carry them before the delicate balance of tension shifted once more. In moments of tension, the most profound change often comes from those we least expect. On this quiet suburban street, where every house seemed identical and every lawn meticulously maintained, an extraordinary moment was quietly unfolding. Among neighbors whispering behind curtains and officers calculating their next steps, one person stepped forward who no one anticipated: the unexpected mediator. At first glance, this neighbor seemed ordinary in every way. Perhaps they had always been quiet, keeping to themselves, never drawn to the spotlight or eager to assert their opinions. But in the crucible of conflict, ordinary people sometimes reveal extraordinary insight. This neighbor, who had watched the events unfold with a combination of curiosity and caution, felt a subtle stirring within, a realization that remaining silent was no longer an option. The situation demanded action, not confrontation, wisdom, not judgment. The mediator's approach was careful. They did not rush forward with authority or insistence, nor did they attempt to dominate the conversation. Instead, they observed, absorbing the nuances of each person's words, the tension in every stance, and the unspoken emotions that hung in the air. There was a delicate art to their intervention, to acknowledge the woman's concerns without inflaming fear, to recognize the man's dignity without alienating the crowd, and to guide the conversation toward understanding without imposing their own agenda. Neighbors who had been watching with varying degrees of skepticism and curiosity suddenly noticed the subtle shift. The mediator's calm voice began to thread through the rising cacophony, asking simple but profound questions. What is the real issue here? How can we all see each other clearly, beyond our assumptions? Could this moment be more than conflict? Perhaps an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to build a stronger sense of community. Even the police officers, trained in de-escalation and crisis management, found themselves observing the impact of the mediator. Their presence, though necessary for safety, was no longer the sole anchor of order. Instead, a quiet force of understanding and empathy began to emerge, one that carried the potential to redirect the energy of the moment toward resolution. Yet, as much as the mediator's presence inspired hope, it also introduced suspense. How would the woman respond? How would the man receive these interventions? And would the neighbors, so accustomed to distance and observation, engage in this unexpected call to reason? The suspense deepened because the mediator was not acting from authority, but from moral courage. They had no power over HOA rules, no official capacity, and no obligation to intervene, but they recognized that action was necessary. In stepping forward, they risked misunderstanding, criticism, or even being dismissed entirely. Yet, courage does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers through deliberate gestures, careful words, and the willingness to carry responsibility when others hesitate. As the mediator guided the conversation, small changes began to ripple through the crowd. Neighbors who had been tense, some defensive, some fearful, now leaned in slightly, listening with a curiosity that was new to the street. The woman, still holding on to her concerns, paused, considering perspectives beyond her initial fear. The man, maintaining his composure, acknowledged the attempt at dialogue, allowing space for tension to dissolve gradually, though the possibility of escalation still lingered. Every moment felt weighted, like the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. Each word from the mediator carried more influence than anyone anticipated. Each nod of understanding, each question that invited reflection, had the potential to prevent disaster or to be misinterpreted and reignite fear. The entire dynamic teetered on the edge of uncertainty, and yet in that uncertainty lay the power of human choice. The power to transform conflict into connection, suspicion into understanding, and fear into empathy. And still, the suspense remained. Who would embrace the mediator's guidance? Who would allow their assumptions to dominate? Could the community truly rise above the immediate tension, or would a single misstep undo the fragile threads of hope that were forming? In that delicate balance, everyone watching, neighbors, the officers, even the woman who had made the call, felt the weight of possibility, aware that the next choices could define not just the outcome of this encounter, but the story of this neighborhood for years to come. The arrival of the police had changed the dynamic on the street. Their presence, usually a reassurance of order and safety, now became a lens through which every action, every glance, and every word was measured. But law and empathy are not always aligned. Rules can be clear, procedures precise, yet human emotion, perception, and judgment are infinitely more complex. On this quiet suburban street, those two forces collided in a way that none of the observers could fully anticipate. The officers approached the man with professionalism, eyes scanning for potential threats, voices calm but authoritative. Their training dictated how they should respond, assess the situation, de-escalate tension, and protect the safety of all involved. Yet, Even as they executed these steps, they were forced to navigate something far less predictable: the emotional landscape of neighbors, the assumptions that had already begun to shape opinions, and the delicate balance of fear and courage standing silently in the driveway. The man, aware of every movement, every word, chose patience over reaction. His calm was not ignorance, nor was it passive acquiescence. It was deliberate, a strategy born from experience and an understanding that empathy could sometimes disarm what authority could not. He looked at the officers, at the woman who had made the call, and at the neighbors who now had begun to gather, and he held his ground, projecting dignity and restraint that contrasted sharply with the tension that had filled the air just moments before. Yet the collision of law and empathy is never simple. The officers, trained to follow protocol, had to reconcile what they observed with what they knew of human behavior in volatile situations. They could enforce rules, they could issue warnings, and they could protect property, but could they ensure that justice was tempered with understanding, that fear did not dictate actions, that empathy guided judgment as much as procedure? This uncertainty created a suspense that extended beyond the man and the woman. It enveloped the entire neighborhood, every person who had become a witness to this unfolding story. Neighbors whispered among themselves, some cautiously, some openly, trying to reconcile the procedures of law with the humanity before them. Questions arose silently in every mind. Would the officers focus solely on the complaint, or would they consider the broader context? Could rules be applied without causing harm, without escalating the tension that already trembled like a live wire across the street? And would the observers, those who had remained hidden behind windows and doorways, recognize the nuances at play, or would they only see what fear and expectation had painted for them? The woman who had called the police was also caught in the collision. She had acted out of a sense of duty, perhaps a need for order, yet now she faced a reality far more complex than she had imagined. Empathy challenged the clarity of her intentions, forcing her to consider not just rules, but consequences, perceptions, and the human dignity of the man she had summoned authorities to confront. Suspense thickened as she paused, uncertain whether to reinforce her position or to step back and allow understanding to take its course. Even the man standing calmly sensed the fragility of the situation. Every gesture from the officers, every whispered comment from neighbors, every subtle shift in posture carried meaning. The collision of law and empathy was a test not only of authority but of human judgment, of the ability to navigate between enforcement and understanding, between fear and reason. One wrong step, one misinterpreted word could unravel the delicate balance painstakingly maintained for these few critical minutes. As moments stretched, the street itself seemed suspended in anticipation. What would triumph? The rigid structure of rules or the pliable, sometimes unpredictable force of empathy? Could human compassion influence even the most procedural minds, and could law coexist with understanding in a way that transformed tension into trust? The suspense was unbearable, because no one could know which path would emerge, which choice would define the day, and which subtle act might determine the course of relationships, perceptions, and the story of the neighborhood for years to come. The neighborhood, usually a portrait of calm and order, now felt fragile, like a tightrope stretched taut over uncertainty. Every house, every yard, every window had become part of the stage for a story that no one had anticipated, a story in which the familiar streets seemed suddenly charged with potential energy, waiting to be released in either conflict or understanding. It was as if the community itself had taken a collective breath, aware that this was a pivotal moment, one that could redefine relationships, assumptions, and trust. From the driveway where the man stood, to the woman who had initiated the police call, to the officers walking cautiously between the two, tension permeated the air. But it was not only the principal actors who felt the weight of the moment. Neighbors emerged from behind closed doors, hesitant yet drawn by a combination of curiosity, fear, and an instinctive recognition that what was happening might be bigger than any single person. The energy of the street had shifted from quiet observation to a palpable suspense, a feeling that the ordinary had been suspended, replaced by something far more consequential. Some residents leaned over fences, whispering to one another, weighing assumptions and trying to predict outcomes. Others stayed behind curtains, silent observers who felt a mix of apprehension and anticipation. Everyone was watching, Yet the community as a whole was on the edge of understanding a truth that only moments like this could reveal, that ordinary people, when faced with uncertainty and tension, have the capacity to shape the outcome in ways that are unpredictable yet profoundly transformative. The man's composure stood in stark contrast to the anxiety of the gathering crowd. He did not react to whispered judgments, sideways glances, or the tension in the air. Instead, he remained calm, aware that his demeanor could influence the street in ways that no one had yet realized. His patience became a quiet challenge to everyone watching. Would they allow fear and assumptions to dictate their actions, or would they rise to the opportunity for understanding, empathy, and connection? Even the police officers, trained to respond with authority and measured control, were confronted with a scene that was beyond procedural clarity. Rules and regulations could guide action, but they could not dictate the perceptions, intentions, and fears of a community on edge. Each step they took, each word they spoke, was weighed not only for legal correctness, but also for its potential to de-escalate or inflame the gathering tension. The suspense of the moment was amplified by the uncertainty of human reaction. Would empathy prevail, or would misjudgment tip the balance toward conflict? Among the neighbors, subtle movements began to emerge, small yet significant. A nod of acknowledgement here, a tentative step forward there, gestures that suggested some were beginning to see beyond their initial fears. Still, the majority lingered in uncertainty, caught between instinctive suspicion and a latent hope that something extraordinary could emerge. The street seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting to see who would act, who would speak, and who would allow assumptions to dictate behavior instead of understanding. The woman who had made the call now faced her own internal conflict. She had acted out of concern, yet the reality of the situation forced her to confront the complexity she had not anticipated. The man's quiet dignity, the neighbor's hesitant engagement, and the officer's careful navigation of the scene challenged her assumptions and left her questioning, could she see humanity in the moment, or would fear continue to dominate her perception? Even the smallest details became imbued with suspense. The sway of a tree branch in the breeze, the faint murmur of voices, the subtle expressions on faces. Each element carried weight, potential meaning, and consequence. The community's collective attention was focused, taut with expectation, aware that the next few actions could ripple through relationships, reputations, and trust. In this delicate, suspended state, the neighborhood teetered on the edge between resolution and escalation. Every heartbeat, every glance, every decision carried the weight of possibility, and in that uncertainty every observer, participant, and authority figure understood that this was no longer merely an HOA dispute. It had become a test of character, empathy, and the fragile bonds that hold a community together. For hours, the neighborhood had been suspended in a state of quiet tension, a fragile equilibrium where every glance, every word, and every subtle gesture seemed magnified. Observers, both near and distant, had been caught in the gravitational pull of the moment, watching as ordinary events stretched into extraordinary significance. Yet no one could predict what would truly define this day, what single decision or subtle action might become the turning point that changed everything in ways no one had anticipated. The man in the driveway, calm and composed, had maintained his dignity throughout the growing tension. Every breath he took, every measured gesture, reflected a deep awareness that patience and resilience often have more power than confrontation. Yet, even in his composed state, there was a quiet recognition. The resolution of this moment did not rest solely on him. The community itself, each neighbor, each observer, each participant in the unfolding drama, held a piece of the outcome in their hands, and in that shared responsibility lay both suspense and possibility. Then, without warning, a subtle shift occurred. A neighbor who had remained in the shadows, watching silently from behind a curtain, finally stepped forward. Their movement was small, a simple gesture, a voice raised in calm inquiry, but it carried the weight of courage and the unexpected. It was a ripple in the still waters of tension, barely noticeable at first, yet its effects began to spread immediately. Others began to notice the action, some hesitantly, some with curiosity, and the energy of the street shifted imperceptibly but irreversibly. The woman who had made the original complaint felt it too. The subtle engagement of someone previously silent challenged her assumptions, forcing her to reconsider the narrative she had built in her mind. The officers, trained to manage conflict, sensed the change as well, realizing that the balance between authority and empathy had tilted, that the moment now contained the potential for something larger than enforcement or reprimand. And the man, still standing with quiet dignity, recognized that the landscape of possibility had shifted. Yet he could not know if this change would lead to resolution, understanding, or a new form of conflict. As more neighbors began to respond, cautiously at first, the turning point became increasingly evident. Conversations emerged that had not existed minutes before, mediated not by authority but by ordinary people choosing to step forward, to listen, and to engage with empathy. It was a demonstration of what happens when courage is contagious, when the energy of a single act spreads quietly, subtly until it shapes the behavior of an entire group. The suspense lay in watching the transformation. How quickly would fear dissolve? How long before understanding prevailed? Small details became magnified in importance. A nod of acknowledgement from one observer, a question asked with genuine curiosity, the way the officers shifted their stance in response. All created a delicate choreography of interaction that could either resolve the situation or unravel it completely. Every person present was aware, consciously or unconsciously, that their next move mattered. And in that awareness, the tension tightened, suspense coiled like a spring, waiting for the next decisive act. Yet the turning point, subtle as it was, did not remove uncertainty. It introduced a new layer. Would the momentum toward empathy and understanding hold, or would it falter under the weight of fear, assumption, or miscommunication? Would the ripple created by a single courageous neighbor continue to spread, or would it collide with resistance and tension in unpredictable ways? Every heartbeat seemed to echo the suspense, every rustle of leaves or distant sound amplified the anticipation of what might come next. Even the observers at the edges of the scene, those who had resisted engagement, felt the pull of the moment. Some were drawn forward, curious and cautious, sensing that the turning point they had not anticipated was now influencing them as well. Others hesitated, unsure whether to join the movement or retreat, and in that hesitation lay the suspense of possibility. The story of the day had become larger than a complaint, larger than a driveway confrontation. It was now a narrative of courage, empathy, and the unpredictable impact of ordinary choices in extraordinary circumstances. And still, despite the subtle shifts and the rising engagement, no one could see the full outcome. The turning point had arrived, but its consequences were yet unknown, lingering like a question in the air, unresolved, pregnant with possibility, suspense, and the quiet anticipation of what would unfold next. Moments of true significance are often defined not by grand gestures, but by the quiet choices individuals make when the world holds its breath. On this neighborhood street, tension had grown to a palpable intensity, the air thick with anticipation, and the weight of every decision pressing on each person present. It was no longer simply a dispute about rules or a single complaint. It had become a test of character, empathy, and resolve. And now, the moment of choice has arrived. The man in the driveway, calm yet vigilant, understood that the unfolding scenario demanded more than composure. It demanded active engagement, the ability to respond thoughtfully to words and actions without succumbing to provocation. He had already demonstrated extraordinary restraint, but the ultimate measure would come not from patience alone, but from the decisions he would make in the next critical moments. His choices, deliberate and measured, would ripple through the crowd, influencing not only the woman who had made the call but also the neighbors who had been watching with a mix of fear, curiosity, and hope. The woman, too, faced her own crossroads. Her initial actions, rooted in fear or concern, had set the stage, yet the unexpected composure and dignity of the man, and the rising engagement of the neighbors, challenged her assumptions. Would she double down on her stance, or would she allow empathy to guide her next words and actions? Every heartbeat seemed to stretch longer than normal, each one echoing with the suspense of the choice before her. Her decision would not only affect the immediate situation, but also shape the way this community understood trust, judgment, and reconciliation. Neighbors, who had lingered on the periphery, now felt the quiet but insistent pull to participate. Some stepped forward, offering questions and reflections that carried the weight of observation, while others hesitated, watching to see how the dynamics would unfold. Each person was faced with a choice: remain passive, succumb to fear, or engage with courage and clarity. And the suspense lay in the uncertainty of who would act, who would falter, and whose decision might tip the balance toward understanding or toward renewed conflict. Even the police officers, trained to maintain order, recognized the subtle but profound shift in the environment. Their role was no longer merely procedural. They were witnesses to a community being tested, watching as ordinary individuals made extraordinary choices under pressure. Each decision taken by the man, the woman, or the neighbors could influence their own actions, whether to enforce rules strictly, exercise discretion, or guide the moment with patience and insight. And in that uncertainty, suspense was amplified. Would law and authority reinforce understanding, or would rigid adherence to procedure risk unraveling the fragile thread of trust forming on the street? The quiet gestures of courage, small nods of acknowledgement, tentative steps toward dialogue, and the careful words spoken all became part of a delicate choreography. Every action was amplified in significance, because every observer was acutely aware that the moment could be resolved with integrity, or destroyed by misjudgment. Even the tiniest choice, a pause, a tone of voice, a decision to speak or remain silent, held the potential to alter the outcome dramatically. As the tension grew, it became clear that the story was no longer about a complaint, a driveway, or an HOA dispute. It was about the power of choice under scrutiny, the unpredictable consequences of decisions made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Each participant, whether in the middle of the street or behind a curtain, understood that the next moves could define the future of relationships, perceptions, and community cohesion. And yet, despite all the subtle gestures and rising engagement, the ultimate choice remained unseen. Suspense lingered, thick and unyielding, as if the neighborhood itself were holding its collective breath. Who would act next? Would the momentum toward understanding hold, or would hesitation, fear, or misinterpretation reverse the progress that had been so painstakingly built? The answer remained unknown, suspended in the space between intention and action, leaving every observer, participant, and authority figure poised on the edge of anticipation. Moments after the street seemed to reach a fragile equilibrium, a new realization began to ripple through the neighborhood. A recognition that actions, no matter how small or deliberate, often carry consequences that no one can fully foresee. The man standing in the driveway had exercised patience and dignity. The woman who had made the complaint had reconsidered her assumptions. Neighbors had begun to engage thoughtfully, and even the officers had adjusted their approach, guided as much by empathy as procedure. Yet, in the subtle interweaving of all these decisions, an unseen consequence was quietly emerging, one that would challenge perceptions, test patience, and hold every observer in suspense. It began with the smallest ripple, a gesture, unnoticed by many at first, that set a chain of reflection into motion. One neighbor, inspired by the courage and restraint displayed by the man, took a step closer, breaking through the hesitation that had kept them passive. Another neighbor, previously skeptical, lowered a voice of criticism and chose to ask a question instead, opening a door for dialogue that had not existed moments before. These tiny acts, seemingly insignificant on their own, began to accumulate into a force that no one could yet measure, a collective energy that threatened to redefine the dynamics of the entire neighborhood. The woman who had called the police could sense it. She felt the weight of every decision she had made, every assumption she had held, and the emerging awareness that her initial actions had unintended repercussions. The neighborhood had shifted under her feet, and now the challenge was not simply defending her perspective, but recognizing the broader implications of her role in the unfolding story. Suspense gripped her as she realized that the outcome of this moment was no longer predictable, that the unseen consequence might shape not only the resolution of the dispute but the way every neighbor would perceive one another going forward. The police officers, too, felt the subtle tension of consequence. Their training had prepared them for conflict, for clear violations and procedural clarity, but not for the complex emotional dynamics that were now at play. Every measured step they took, every word spoken with careful neutrality, carried implications that could reinforce harmony or, if misread, exacerbate the latent tensions that lingered in the air. The collision of law and empathy, of procedure and human connection, had produced an outcome that could not be managed solely by protocol. It required understanding, discernment, and the quiet vigilance to respond to shifts that were often imperceptible. The man in the driveway, ever composed, sensed the weight of this unseen consequence more keenly than anyone. His restraint had been observed, his dignity noted, yet he understood that the true test lay not in appearances, but in the chain reaction that had quietly begun. Every gesture of courage, every attempt at dialogue, every choice to pause rather than react, carried forward into the collective consciousness of the neighborhood. Each act, compounded with others, held the potential to either solidify understanding or unravel the fragile threads of trust that had been so delicately woven. Neighbors, who had watched from behind windows or leaned over fences, began to feel a strange, almost imperceptible pressure. The story had grown beyond a single driveway dispute. It had become a reflection of the entire community's capacity for empathy, courage, and thoughtful engagement. Each observer now faced a choice: remain passive, allow fear or judgment to dominate, or step forward and contribute to the constructive outcome that was slowly emerging. The suspense was unbearable, because no one could know which path each person would take, and every decision held consequences that would echo far beyond the immediate moment. Even the most subtle shift, a glance, a nod, a whispered acknowledgement, could tip the scales. The unseen consequence was like a shadow stretching across the street, tangible only in its effects, impossible to measure but impossible to ignore. The entire neighborhood seemed to pulse with anticipation, collectively holding its breath, aware that the next series of choices would not only determine the resolution of the dispute, but also reveal the deeper character of the community itself. And still, despite all the awareness, all the courage, and all the careful deliberation, the full scope of this consequence remained hidden. Suspense lingered in every mind, a quiet tension that suggested that no matter how composed, empathetic, or courageous the individuals had been, the story was far from over, and the ultimate outcome, the one that would define relationships, perceptions, and trust, was yet to be revealed. The street, once quiet and orderly, now held the weight of countless choices, countless acts of courage, and countless unspoken judgments. Each neighbor, each observer, each participant had played a role, some overt, some subtle, some unnoticed, but all had contributed to the unfolding story. The HOA complaint that had begun as a simple call had transformed into a mirror, reflecting not just the actions of a single man or woman, but the character, fears, and potential of an entire community. The man in the driveway had shown patience and dignity beyond expectation. The woman who had called the police had confronted her own assumptions. The neighbors had begun to engage, hesitating, questioning, and discovering the courage to step forward. Even the officers, trained to respond with authority, had been forced to navigate empathy and discretion in a way that few could anticipate. Each action, each word, each glance had accumulated into a force that could not be ignored, a force that would ripple through the neighborhood long after the street returned to its routine calm. And yet, the story was far from over. Suspense lingered like a shadow over the community. Who would take the next decisive step? Whose courage would tip the balance, and whose hesitation would allow fear or misunderstanding to dominate? Would the unseen consequences of every choice lead to lasting unity, or would they unravel the fragile threads of trust that had been so carefully woven in the midst of tension? Every heartbeat in the neighborhood seemed to echo the uncertainty. The ordinary had become extraordinary, not through spectacle, but through the quiet, deliberate decisions of individuals. And as the sun cast long shadows across the street, each neighbor, each observer, felt the weight of possibility pressing on their conscience. The story was a reminder that change, understanding, and connection often emerge from the smallest acts of courage. But that the ultimate outcome, the true measure of human character, remains hidden until it is revealed in the moments yet to come. The street stood poised, suspended between resolution and uncertainty, the air thick with anticipation, as if the next breath, the next choice, the next word could define everything. And in that stillness, one question lingered, unspoken yet undeniable: who will act next, and how will their action reshape the fate of this neighborhood?